Hello, and welcome to another episode of Pod Strickland. I'm your host, Shwin and this is episode 503. I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Stacy. That is at StacyPatton89 on Twitter. Stacy, how are you doing?
Doing pretty well. It's chilly today. It's been like 80 plus every day. It's super sunny, and the sun doesn't go down here. So, but yeah, doing pretty well.
Good to hear. We're not here to talk about the weather. We're going to talk about the Knicks and all of the new things that have cropped up in their coaching search, which, depending on your viewpoint, is either them doing due diligence or a sign of massive dysfunction and chaos unfolding in real time. We'll talk about that. But before we do get started, I do have to make a few announcements. First, we need that Strickland has a YouTube channel where you may be watching this podcast. If you are and not done so already, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, leave us a comment. That'd be a huge help to us. The Strickland also has merchandise which you can find on our website at www.strick.land. There's a link to take you to the merchandise store. There's all kinds of cool stuff on there, like t-shirts, sweatshirts, hats, coffee mugs, water bottles, you name it, we got it. Strickland also has a Patreon, which you can subscribe to. There are a number of different tiers. There's a $6 that gets you access to Pod Strickland, the podcast that I host every Friday with Prez. You also get access to Takes My Vs Bozos, a podcast hosted by Andrew Steele, a.k.a. Doug, along with Zach Blatter. And you get access to the Strickland Discord where the conversation never stops. Then further tiers, there's a $9 tier that gets you access to Strick and Roll, which is no longer my solo pod, but a pod that I host along with YC, where we get to rant and rave about the Knicks even more. You also get access to wonderful premium articles by Matthew Murdo, one of the best in the business, and you get access to Strictly NFL, which you guessed it is a podcast about the NFL that is hosted by Konstantin Metrikos and Desmond Novak. There are further tiers. There's a $15 tier, $30 tier, $50 tier, and a $100 tier that's come with a variety of additional benefits, like listening in on pod recordings, merchandise discounts, and potentially hosting a podcast alongside yours truly one day, whether you choose to subscribe or not. None of this would be possible without you. So, without further ado, let's get started. A lot has happened in the last 20. Who knows what defines a lot has happened in the last 12 to 24 hours. But what we do know for sure is that the Knicks asked permission to interview Ime Udoka, Chris Finch, and Jason Kidd from the Houston Rockets, Minnesota Timberwolves, and Dallas Mavericks, respectively. They were denied on all three. The reporting indicates that the Knicks have been most intrigued by Jason Kidd. That's the reporting. Whether how true that is, how accurate that is, if that fully captures the Knicks hierarchy's interest level, I can't say for sure. But that is where it stands right now. Ian Begley was also on with Jonathan Macri of the Knicks Film School, on the Knicks Film School podcast, I should say, and mentioned that they were going to interview Mike Brown. Mike Brown is somebody who they interviewed back in 2020 before they hired Tom Thibodeau. He most recently coached with the Kings, won Coach of the Year, actually there with them his first year. I want to provide as much context here as I can. This is from Ian Begley as well. This is something that he wrote today. He mentioned that the Knicks are in no rush to hire a head coach, that they're going to do their due diligence, and that asking permission to interview those coaches in terms of Ime Udoka, Chris Finch, and Jason Kidd was part of that process for them. But the most interesting thing I thought in this it was a very short article he put out, but he mentioned this. To reiterate, the timing of the Thibodeau firing was not tied in any way to the Suns' decision on Johnnie Bryant, a former Knicks associate head coach. Bryant was a finalist for the Suns job, though they ended up for Jordan not. And so again, in this he writes, to reiterate, the timing of the Thibodeau firing was not tied in any way to the Suns' decision on Johnnie Bryant, the former Knicks associate head coach. Bryant was a finalist for the Suns job, though they ended up hiring former Cleveland assistant Jordan Ott. Additionally, CP, the franchise of Knicks Fan TV today, on his stream mentioned that James Dolan is a fan of Johnnie Bryant and that he would be cool with the Knicks hiring Johnnie Bryant and having an experienced assistant coach. So my conspiracy theory, this is my conspiracy theory, so take this for what it is. My conspiracy theory is that Johnnie Bryant has been their preferred candidate. They fired Tom Thibodeau because Bryant was potentially and maybe even about to get the Suns job. He has known that he is the Knicks' top choice. He took his name out of the Suns coaching search without saying it publicly. And they have done this. They're going to go through this entire search. And then at the end of it, I think they will pick Johnnie Bryant. And maybe Mike Brown will be his assistant head coach, associate head coach, as they like to call them nowadays, the top assistant. And as a somewhat of a quid pro quo to the Suns, the Knicks have allowed them to use their name in the national media via Shams to, help drive the market for a Kevin Durant trade. That's my conspiracy theory. What are your thoughts on my conspiracy theory? And what are your thoughts on just the general nature of the coaching search? Actually, let's just go with the conspiracy theory first, and then we'll go back to the coaching search thing.
There were two shooters
on the grassy knoll, right?
Well, we're talking about Dallas, right? Isn't that the conspiracy theory involving Dallas we're talking about? I think what I was asking myself, right? I'm pretty aligned with you. If the plan was to hire Johnnie Bryant from the beginning, there is a perceived issue, right? Real or not, you are going to say, well, this guy got you the Eastern Conference Finals, he's had more success than any other coach. You're handing the reins to an inexperienced amateur, or you hire someone who just got fired. If you go where they don't seem to be interested in Mike Malone, but him or Mike Brown, right? So you're not going to. So on the one hand, I don't think Leon Rose prioritizes winning the press conference. Quite literally, as has been talked about ad nauseum. Did you know he doesn't do press conferences, Shwin?
I was not aware of that, actually. That's surprising.
But if that was the worry, right, this is exactly how they'd act, right? They would say, look, we're trying to get Jason Kidd. We're trying to get Ime Udoka. We're going through a process. Because if they hired Johnnie Bryant the first day, one, there was no process. This is politics, right? And this is what they were criticized for with Tibbs, right? The search was a sham, no pun intended. And they went with Leon's friend. So I think that if that was true, everything they have done matches. That doesn't make it true. The events are also in line with the idea that they really do want Jason Kidd. They desperately want a slam dunk guy who's having success right now. But they're also not loose with compensation. They clearly have a good relationship with Bryant, and he might not be the guy. Maybe they like Mike Brown. There's a lot to like there. I think Benji from Knicks Film School said, he has turbocharged offenses from good to great. And that's the number one requirement for a coach. I think Benji has been pretty measured. He obviously had a lot of praise for Tibbs. I think he has fairly criticized a lot of the unfair criticisms that Tibbs has received. I think you and I both have. I don't think we believe the minutes bullshit, right?
Yeah.
Well, not in terms of causing injuries. I think we do think he plays too many guys, too many minutes, but that's for different reasons. So, my point is, if this was just to show that we went through the process because they know they're going to get criticized if they don't, this would be in line with that, even if they had a plan. And I think the people saying they don't have a plan is like, well, if they just immediately went to a guy, you would criticize them for not having a process, right? So when they traded Porzingis, for example, right, that happened very, very quickly.
Oh God. Well, it was perceived to have happened very quickly.
Right. It probably didn't, right? But they kept all of that out of the media. Now it's a disaster that, they were turned down by Kidd. They were turned down by the Mavs. It's like, well, what is the actual cost of that, right? Does that drive other coaches from, maybe it helps them drive the cost up and it gives them leverage. But, I think that, I don't know if Bryant's the guy. I can't say that. And for all I know, Kidd really was the guy they wanted. Or if for some reason the Mavs said, yeah, they'd be like, okay, maybe it's like, if you want to date the woman you're interested in, right, who you think you're compatible with, maybe you show that you're going for Sydney Sweeney first, right, or whatever, right, to show that you're not just going straight for it. I don't know, but I think it's in line with your conspiracy theory, quote unquote. But yeah,
I would throw this out there. If you were wanting to show that you were going through the process, but you ultimately are almost already kind of leaning towards a certain candidate, does it not make some sense to go after coaches that are probably not likely to be able to get, to have their teams allow them to interview? When that list first dropped, I was kind of like, I could see the Kidd one just because Dallas is in such a weird position. But what I don't think people fully appreciate, and I do think, I want to say James Edwards wrote about this in his piece in The Athletic earlier this week. One, yeah, it's weird because obviously they do the Luka trade. Now they have the number 1 pick, so they're going to get Cooper Flagg. But Kyrie tore his ACL. And I think the only reason Kyrie and they were able to kind of keep that team together even after the Luka trade and keep guys competing, even after the Kyrie injury and AD being out, all this stuff, was Kidd. I think he gets a lot of buy-in from his guys, which is why I do buy that they at least want to talk to him. We know that he was kind of like a finalist back in 2020 when they eventually hired Tibbs. So I'm not trying to dismiss the idea of the process in itself, because I think part of the reason you go through a process, even if you have a strong preference for candidate X, is you never know who can surprise you. And there's also value in just sitting down with people to get their views on the roster, to get their views on what they would do, how they would tinker with XYZ thing, how they might use player Y or whatever. They're to get all those kind of insights, there's a value to that. So I'm not dismissing it entirely, but I just think if you look at it, okay, so Kidd, there's a lot going on there, but getting him out of Dallas wouldn't have been easy, right? Why on earth would the Timberwolves let Chris Finch interview for another position? Why on earth would the Rockets let Udoka interview for another position? And when you think of it that way, it's almost like, okay, so they picked 3 guys that it's going to be pretty hard to get them out of the jobs they're in currently, if they're even interested in leaving in the first place. You imagine they might have known that there was some interest, just because, why else would you even bother asking? So that's part of it. The other thing that I find very curious is, the piece I mentioned, my conspiracy theory of, the Knicks they're letting the Suns kind of use us as, leaking our name and interest in KD to help drive the market. Well, the reason I find that interesting is because I have a 22-inch now. No, the reason I find that interesting is the first report that we got from Shams about the first report he put out, or that he kind of mentioned, was the Knicks had made an offer for Durant at the deadline. I kind of didn't buy that, really, when it came out. I mean, I think teams talk, and maybe they might have thrown out a construct, the construct of a trade, but I don't think they've.
Conceptions of a construct.
Yeah, I just don't really. I don't know. I thought that report was weird, but
you think it was put out because in exchange for them not taking Bryant?
I think more than that. It's almost like, hey, we really like this guy. I think Bryant probably feels if that's the case, I think Bryant would feel very confident about his chances of getting the New York job. I think the Knicks job is way more enticing than the fucking Suns job. He obviously knows the situation quite well. Like, I think there's a lot that would appeal to him, but I think it's possible he was about to get the Suns job, and then it's like at the last second, it's like, hey, actually, I'm good. So it's like almost like, hey, we kind of maybe fucked you over here. So in exchange, you can, throw our name out in all of this. And that also occurred the day after they fired Tom Thibodeau, or maybe the day of, whatever. It was very shortly after. And like, I don't know, just this whole timeline to me seems very, it's odd. It's odd. And then you get this report from Begley today where it's like, no, the Knicks definitely didn't fire. They definitely didn't fire Tom Thibodeau just because Johnnie Bryant was a finalist for the Suns job. Totally never happened. Not real. It's like, that's the kind of thing I would want out there. If that's exactly like if I was trying to cover my tracks of like the idea that we didn't go through a full search, or that there wasn't a process, or that like, not even that there wasn't a process, but that you didn't go into the process with candidate X, like, 99% of the way there. So I find all that interesting. And then the other part is like, I just don't get how anybody finds like the thing with getting turned down, right, by Minnesota, Houston, and Dallas, to interview their coaches. You could ask permission for those guys. Like, we don't know kind of what their schedule is here. So you can ask permission, then it's like, okay, well, then we have to set up interviews. When are we setting up these interviews? Who are you interviewing in the meantime? Like, were they going to interview Mike Brown anyway? I would assume they were. That Taylor Jenkins, I think, was another name floated by James Edwards as somebody that might be interested. Maybe you were going to talk to him anyway. Like, I don't think. I just reject the idea that like this is all some humiliating thing. This is embarrassing. They have no plan. They don't know what they're doing. I don't know how you can. I just don't know where this comes from. This idea of like this is what a coaching search is. Like, this is how it works. Is that you have to actually try to talk to people, and if you are interested in candidates that are under contract with other teams, yeah, you got to get permission from them, and maybe you're going to get turned down, and like you have to accept that might be part of it. I just don't really think my takeaway from that is it's embarrassing or indicative of not having a plan. It would, and this is all like they didn't have like, and then the other final piece that I just want to get out there, and I want to get your thoughts on this. I do not view hiring a coach to fill this vacancy. I view that as an entirely separate decision from firing Tom Thibodeau. I think you fire Tom Thibodeau because you determine this guy, for all the good that he brings, for all of the stability he brings, for all of the good things he's done in New York, we do not believe in this guy to get us over the top. And maybe more importantly, this guy just doesn't have the ear of the locker room. He doesn't have the buy-in from the locker room that he has gotten from previous groups. And at that point, if you keep him just because you're like, well, we don't know who we'd hire, that's just a cop-out. That's bullshit. Like, that's why you do a coaching search, right? Like, hey, we don't believe in this guy to kind of get us to where we believe we have the talent to go. And therefore, we have to, like, it's an independent decision. There are two parts of a process. The first process is the guy that we have in charge, is he the guy? Is he the one that we believe in? If you think no, keeping him is a waste of your time and cowardly, in my opinion. Once you determine he's not, okay, now you have to go out and find a coach, and you have to go through this process. And the key part of this that I think, I believe me and you kind of accept is an inherent risk in this, is maybe you hire a bum. That's possible. Maybe you hire a bad coach and it blows up in your face and you look stupid. That's very possible. I would not deny that as a possibility. I think people that think there's no risk in firing Tom Thibodeau are very wrong. You can't win as many games as he did and have the level of success that he did in New York as a total accident. That's not possible. He clearly was a positive factor in New York. But is he moving the needle to where you need it to is a separate conversation point. And, there's risk in moving that way. But I just I have a really big problem with how people are framing this entire thing, because to me, they're separate decisions.
Yeah, so I'm going to touch on two things. So I'm going to get back to your previous point where, I do think there is, to counter that a little bit, even though I think I am more aligned with maybe not your full-on conspiracy theory involving the Suns and everything, or that Bryant is the guy, capital T, capital G. There is this trap of thinking they're playing 5D chess. I remember, the first draft process, right? They're making all these trades and all that. They're putting out they want Obi. And I was like, oh, this is a smoke screen. They're trying to get Killian Hayes to fall or whatever. And it was motivated partially because Obi Toppin was among two players. The other one was Halliburton, that I didn't want them to draft in that draft. Lesson in humility and all that. But they wanted Obi. It was not 5D chess, right? Everyone does this, right? Trump supporters. He's only saying this to get elected. No, that's actually what he wanted to do. So there is this danger for us to think the front office is playing 5D chess when they're just doing something normal. Maybe they really did want Kidd. Maybe they prefer an experienced head coach, and there's reasons to. The second part of what you're saying, I think there's two things. There is a segment of Knicks fans, more of them are off Twitter, who still are skeptical, right? That the Dolan is pulling the shots. You hear Dolan being in the interview and you're triggered. I'm not trying to judge that feeling. You see the 5 years of good process, right? In terms of, even when they make mistakes, they learn from it, pivot acceptably, keep moving forward. You see that, but you hear the name Dolan and it triggers 20 years in the desert, right? So I get that. I also think there are people who are preying on it. I don't think it's Knicks content creators. I think it is more the national media. I think it's interesting that Rachel Nichols has basically not talked about the Knicks at all for 5 years, but decided today to chime in on them being a mess. I think, there's been multiple people who have made this point. I think Begley did to start. If Leon Rose had this decision forced on him, and maybe that's too binary, maybe there's gray area, I don't know. But if he had this decision forced on him, he doesn't need this job. He's independently wealthy. He's done a good job here. If his passion is working as a sports GM, and Leon Rose got fired, or Leon Rose left his job tomorrow, there would be teams on the phone asking, like, would you want to be our GM? But I think there is this segment of Knicks fans who still can't believe that, no, we're just well run. And if there's any other front office that was looking at currently employed coaches that are doing well and shot their shot, you would say that's part of the process. You should leave no stone unturned and all that, right? Chris Persianen said the same thing. As to who their preference is, only we can guess, but the front office has earned the benefit of the doubt that for whatever else may be true, they're not a shit show. Not just because Dolan has somehow reformed, because I don't think it seems very clear that Leon Rose doesn't suffer nonsense, or that kind of thing. I'll throw this one back to you, though. This came to me more with Minnesota. I'm less familiar with the assistants on Dallas or Houston, although I would imagine given those organizations, they're qualified staff and probably guys that are going to be in the names. A guy I think you mentioned on the Cord was Mike Nori. I've seen him pop up in articles as like an assistant coach who's looked at as as an eventual head coach. Minnesota also employs Pablo Prigioni, former Knick, obviously ties to the organization. And I think you know more about the ins and outs of this process than I do. So I'll ask this. Is there potentially the possibility that The Knicks are going after these assistant coaches or after these head coaches to get some intel on, if you're looking at Pablo and Nori, is it useful to talk to Finch and say, well, look, who's your guy? When you need a big adjustment, Nori's the one everyone talks about. He's the architect of defense. Is that true? What is Pablo bringing? Is he ready for this job? Is there benefit to that part of the process as well? And a possible explanation for the teams they've chosen, because they didn't choose Miami. And we know that they haven't had a great history of hiring Miami assistants, to say the least. So I'm curious if you think there's any benefit from that angle.
Yeah, I think there's a benefit in a couple ways. Like, again, I'm not going to speak to what Mike Nori or Pablo Prigioni potentially, what they're strong with, what are they best at, what their expertise is. I don't know. I cannot tell you. I know for sure what they've done. I just know that, especially in Mike Nori's case, this is an assistant coach who has interviewed for head coaching positions and has talked about, in favorable terms, by people around the league or whatever. What I do think is interesting is, on top of what you're saying, yeah, I think there's a value to maybe Finch has insight into, obviously what those guys do on his staff, what their strengths are, what are they best at, how do they connect with players? That's something that we've heard. It's kind of something they're looking for, somebody that's more of a people person than Tibbs, in some ways more of a relationships person than Tibbs is. And there's value to that. I also think there's a value to, hey, you coached Karl Anthony Towns for a couple of years. What did you like? What worked? What did you like? What were your drawbacks? How did you get around issue X? How did you all of those type of things? I think they have value for sure. And that's kind of what I mean, where the value in going through the process, even if there is, to your point, maybe they're not playing 5D chess. It's also very possible. But even if you are playing 5D chess and this is all designed to ultimately land Johnnie Bryant as the head coach, this is why you go through the process, because you never know who can surprise you. And these are all people who are very well versed in the NBA and in basketball, strategy and relationships and all those type of things. Talking to these people is valuable. It can provide insight to your roster. It can provide insight to how you approach things organizationally, potentially. Like, oh, actually, you know what? We didn't hire this guy, but he had this idea, which is really cool. And we think we're going to kind of maybe implement that potentially. Like, things like that are possible. And that's why, obviously you've been in the job market before in your career. And you know that like a common refrain you'll hear from people is, even if you don't think a job is for you, even if it's not, if it's not ideal, or there is value sometimes just going through the process, hearing what they have to say and seeing what's out there, right? Like, you never know what could come up. And I think that's a piece of this that gets overlooked or dismissed, or not even forget dismissed. I don't even think it gets discussed. Like, I think there was a value to the Knicks. I don't think this is not some hidden secret that when Leon Rose took over, Tom Thibodeau was a heavy favorite to get the job. Like, that was reported the moment that Leon Rose was hired, that Tom Thibodeau would be a favorite to get the job, or was the favorite to get the job. And he was the favorite the entire way through. We know that. But they went through the process. They interviewed so many people, and they had, finalists and all this. Like, they interviewed and talked to a lot of people. That's valuable. Hey, I mean, at that time, obviously the roster was nowhere near as talented. They were very much entering almost at the ground floor, and those conversations would be different. But so now when you're going through it, maybe you have different, your entire kind of what are we trying to target in this next head coach? What do we need from this next head coach? It's a different thing, because you're not where you were. You're at a different level. So talking to bright and smart people around basketball, in the NBA, outside the NBA, whatever, all of that has value. And I think that is something that should be understood almost as a fact. Like it's because it's a fact in almost every other industry that is there. Like it's just true. You see this in the NFL all the time, right? You see this in other sports. Like this is just normal kind of standard operating procedure, I guess you could say. Do I think the Knicks are a little bit unconventional in the way they do things? Yeah. But I also think the fact that they don't talk to the media and that there's kind of just like this radio silence means they're almost like this empty vessel that you can fill with whatever you want to fill it up with. Like whatever you want their intentions to be, those can be your intentions. So in our case, we're Knicks fans who want to believe that everything that is happening is perfectly orchestrated and happening for a reason. So we will attach optimistic feelings to all of this. Whereas I think a lot of national media folks, local media folks who don't get access and want access and think that Leon Rose should talk publicly and all these type of things, they look at this and are like, well, this is a disaster. They don't know what they're doing. They didn't want to fire. They fired Tom Thibodeau because Dolan forced them or because they were overreacting to losing the Eastern Conference Finals. And like, I don't know. I kind of just don't really. Again, like maybe this could very well just be me being an optimist and being a delusional Knicks fan or whatever. But I just look at this and I'm like, they went to Game 6 of the Eastern Conference Finals. They had a literally an exact net of a 0 point differential in the playoffs, which, generally speaking, if the margins are that tight, you overachieved to get to the Eastern Conference Finals. Now, what I would suggest is, one, I think they didn't overachieve. I think I guess to some extent you could say they overachieved. I didn't think they could beat Boston, so I'll say they overachieved. But what was the process to getting that done? And is that replicable? Is that the best you can hope for? Like I'll throw an example at you. Darvin Ham took the Lakers to the Western Conference Finals in 2023, right? Got them to the Western Conference Finals. A lot of Lakers fans constantly throughout that offseason were like, this guy sucks. He's terrible. He's a bad head coach, blah, blah, blah. They go into the last season. Darvin Ham coaches them again. They lose in round 1. He's fired. And it's kind of like, okay, well, did they keep Darvin Ham for an extra year because they actually thought he was doing a good job? Or did they keep him for an extra year because they were like, it would look bad if we fired him after getting to the Western Conference Finals? And then they wasted another year with Darvin Ham, who then lost in round 1 and did a lot of weird stuff with his lineups. And now they have JJ Redick, who, worth noting, the Lakers had their own messy coaching search last year. Now JJ Redick is the second coming of Jesus Christ. But they lost around, so they that's how they landed their head coach, and that's how they moved on from Darvin Ham. The point is, if you're the Knicks, is it better to just be like, hey, fuck the optics? The optics, there's no good time to fire a head coach, by the way. Like it's never an ideal thing to do. You're never like, man, I'm so pumped to fire our head coach. Like that's not what any executive wants to do, especially when it's a head coach you hired and a head coach you just extended last year. So I just look at all of that in totality. I'm like, I mean, we talked about this yesterday in Discord, but like we just played we played 90 or 100 games this year, exactly 100 games this year. The Knicks played 100 games this year between regular season and playoffs. What did we learn about this team? We learned that Jalen Brunson's really good, Cat's really good, OG Anunoby and Mikal Bridges and Josh Hart are quality players who we already knew were quality players. Deuce McBride is good. Mitchell Robinson is really good when he's healthy. Like, we didn't learn anything about various combinations and how they play together. How effective are they in this situation? How does this lineup match up against specific types of opponents? We didn't learn any of that because we didn't try it. And that, to me, between kind of just how the team devolved, I would say, in terms of their offense anyway, over the course of the season, to me, those are reasons where you're like, hey, you know what? It's time to move on. Like, this is just not it. This is not it. And people can be upset about that. And I think you can, again, because of the Knicks' radio silence, you can kind of say whatever you want until they hire somebody and you can potentially be right. be it negative or positive. But like, I just don't look at this and what they're doing and how they're operating as like, what a disaster. This is a mess. This is a shit show. And they should have never fired Tom Thibodeau. I just don't agree with that. And, again, part of the reason you should try to talk to people is getting different ideas about the roster. If you have determined Tom Thibodeau did a bad job, did not get the most out of this team, that there's more, you can get more out of this roster than he did, then it behooves you to talk to people and see if they feel the same way. And if they do, how would they go about it? How do you think you would get more out of this roster? What would you be your ideas? How would you use Karl-Anthony Towns? What do you think about playing Deuce McBride more with Jalen Brunson? Like blah, blah, blah. All these type of things. You can talk about that. And that, I think, is ultimately the value in going through the process and talking to these people, whoever they may be. And yeah, that's kind of like my long-winded answer to your question.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and it's and I think we don't know all of the ins and outs of how this goes. Again, I really think if you did an A/B test and it was an organization that is well respected, I think it'd be covered a different way. But that's my personal bias. I will say I think there's two teams that get. What do you think the two teams that get covered differently than everybody else are?
Sorry, say that again.
What are the two teams that get covered nationally different than everybody else?
In the NBA?
Yeah. Maybe there's three.
The Knicks, and the Lakers.
And then I think you make a case for Boston.
I'd say Boston does get covered differently, and everything that they get, the way they get covered is that everything is wonderful and
sunshine and roses.
Yeah,
the rainbows. So yeah, I do think there is something there, but I think we're also biased a little bit as Knicks fans. So I mean, I think that it's just it's the stigma they have that even after 5 years of pretty high level competence and consistent growth, you're seeing. Let's talk about the coaching search in general, right? I think we are not necessarily in the position to evaluate. We know things like this is a defensive coach, this is a player development guy, this is an offensive coach. We know the teams they've coached on and what those teams have done. We don't really know what a coach's philosophy is until he has the reins in a specific situation. What do you want to see? What are the top 2 or 3 qualities you want to see, or criteria, whatever you want to call it, from the coach that Knicks hire?
I would say, honestly, pretty basic. I think offensive creativity is like the thing that people are talking about or highlighting the most. And I don't dismiss that. I think it's important. I think the Knicks could be well served to have a more creative offensive mind at the helm. And I think Tibbs is just so weird to me because I feel like his creativity came out when he was shorthanded, but when he had his best talent available, he was just like, we're going to run power I. See if you can line up and stop us. Like, it's like, dude, what happened to all of the fucking like cool motion and double reverses and all this shit? Like, just, he's one of these coaches. But yeah, I think that creativity is fair. But what I really would like is a coach that is versatile in his approach defensively, versatile schematically, versatile in his lineup construction. Like, just as an example, I think that one of the frustrating parts of this season was almost exclusively using Cat at the 5. And I know this is like a hot take. I'm still not convinced that's actually his best position. I'm not convinced that you're not best served using him mostly at the 4 and then using him at the 5 as a kind of change up throughout games. But I don't know. I could be wrong on that. I've only watched Cat for 1 year and we only saw him at the 5. But like, I would like to see a coach who's like, yeah, let's play double big. Let's play 5 out. Let's play 1 in, 4 out. Like, there are so many different ways to align your team. Let's play with no bigs, right? Like there's all kinds of ways to play. That and I think not exploring that stuff was a limitation of Tibbs, and that's something I would definitely want to see a willingness from a new head coach. When I talk about versatility defensively, it's like, hey, let's mix in zone. Let's try switching. Let's try blitzing. Let's work through all of these different options throughout the course of a season, right? Let's be better about it. Hey, let's pre-switch and try to do more, pre-rotate, pre-switch, whatever, to avoid having Brunson go, being put into actions, to avoid Cat being put into actions. Those type of things are like they were just not really up in Tibbs' wheelhouse. Credit to him for having a switch way more in the Boston series, but we know that was very like uncomfortable for him, and he deserves credit for it. I would say, if nothing else, that was like he can kind of put that as I think his top achievement in his time in New York was winning that series the way he did it, and the defensive adjustment he made. So like, I would like that. And then I will flat out say this because I think it's true. I think they need a coach who can challenge players to their face directly. I think they need a coach who is okay with having tough conversations with players. Like, for example, we talked about this all the time. It was like, oh, I can't believe we didn't start Deuce McBride once this season or whatever, with in place of Josh Hart. Let's say like the new guy comes in, he tries that out. And let's say that over a longer sample, it's not that good, actually. So you need to move something else. And maybe so you got to move Deuce McBride back to the bench. I want a coach who's going to like be able to get to kind of handle those type of things and handle them while talking to the guy personally. Like, hey, Deuce, you know what? This isn't working out the way we want it. We're going to move you back to the bench. No issues there. Like, this is not an indictment on you. Like, we know Tibbs was not that kind of guy, right? Like, he was just like, okay, I'm the coach. Do what I want you to do. Accept my instructions and, like, let's move on. There's no personal conversation there. I think that having that type of personal conversation, personal connection with players, it can help you both in terms of, like, whatever. I just think there's a value to it, and I think that they need a coach who's a little bit more of a – it's kind of like I don't actually view Tibbs as, like, this taskmaster unless you're a young player. I don't think Tibbs like is that hard on veterans at all. I mean, the guys on the team talk about this. We don't practice, Jeff Teague has talked about it. Tibbs was pretty awesome, like he said, right? Tibbs was chill. Let's kind of do whatever. I think they need a coach who's a little bit more demanding and comfortable challenging players. That's the way I can put it. Like, a coach is gonna be like, hey, Josh, do you want to get your fucking head in the game and rotate to this guy? Hey, Cat, can you put your fucking hands up and play at the level on this screen and not just like get exasperated, call a timeout and demand guys play harder and execute harder, whatever. Like, I think they need a different kind of personal touch from the head coach. Those would be the things I'm looking at mostly. And just to be clear, like, I don't think the coach needs to be a fucking asshole. Maybe it's a nice guy approach. I have no idea. But they need somebody who's going to, I think, challenge all of these guys in a way that I just kind of think Tibbs was not going to do. And that's okay. Sometimes you need a new style of leadership. Sometimes you need a new voice to kind of change things up. But I do think they need a new voice. I think they need I don't want to say a new total. I also think it's a mistake to be like, well, we had X coach, so now we need the polar opposite. I don't think that's true. Because I think, that almost suggests that Tibbs, everything that he did was bad. And I absolutely don't think I don't believe that to be the case. But, what are the things that we were unhappy with, right? What were the things we felt he was lacking in? And I think, when I kind of think through that, it's like, okay, lineup versatility, scheme versatility. Yeah, sure, offensive creativity, but like I mentioned, like that personal connection, that personal touch, that ability to communicate with players and challenge them at times in a way that Tibbs was never going to do. Those are the things I would prioritize.
Yeah, I mean, those are the general patterns, right? Whether it's Josh Hart or Randall, I think this is a guy who can struggle at times to hold his best players accountable. I think he has the courage to make good lineup decisions when it's obvious, or not obvious is the wrong word. But we've talked about, willing to leave Jalen Brunson on the bench, willing to leave Cat on the bench when the lineup without him isn't getting you back in the game. That's very easily defensible. I think they do need someone to juice the offense and get Jalen Brunson off ball more. Without knocking him as like a quote unquote 1A, we've seen LeBron struggle to win as a heliocentric guy, right? He won championships when he was both on and off ball. The most heliocentric would probably be LA, but Anthony Davis took on a lot of creation. His chemistry with Kyrie during that finals run was pretty important. And of course, the way Spoelstra used him was, in many different ways as a chess piece more than just the queen, or as a kind of versatile chess piece more than, well, queen is versatile. But the point I think that I'm making is that that is the second best player of all time. The best player of all time, again, was putting up, he averaged 38 for a season. He's putting up 32, 8, and 8. Never won a championship. Talk about what you want about the triangle, but it put Scottie Pippen on ball, not because he was a better on-ball player than Jordan, but it frees up Jordan to attack in many different ways. I think that is the biggest next step for the Knicks, is that Brunson, look, you have a guy that can get you an efficient shot basically at will. Or a moderately efficient shot at will. You need to be able to translate that. It is like if you only throw deep balls to a super fast 4-4 guy on 3rd and long. No, you want the threat of that to open up his slant routes on 2nd and 5. So you want to be able to run him on running downs deep. You want to open up the run game. You want to make them account for him with many different players on the field in different positions that are unpredictable. So that to me is the number one, and I would agree with Benji on that. Juicing the offense specifically by using Jalen Brunson in different ways. Part of that might be constrained by roster limitations. But we've seen that even when there were better secondary creators, we had quickly. Whatever the criticisms of RJ Barrett are, we had him, and he could at least get 2 feet in the paint and draw attention. We had Randall. It was still, we always seemed to devolve to a heliocentric offense. And so I think that is the key to unlocking the next level for a team that clearly has a lot of talent. Maybe it can't happen. Maybe Mikal Bridges is not a good enough passer. OG can create his own shot, but can't do much else. Cat can only pass from a standstill. You can't pound the post 50 times. You can, defend him creative ways. Maybe there is a lack of dynamism to the roster. I would feel better about a coach who could max that out as much as possible. And then you make roster moves. So that's priority number one to me. I think number two is adaptiveness and a willingness to experiment. I think what you notice in these playoffs is how absurd the whole situational thing, not absurd, because there's other coaches like that. And I'm not going to say that situational means only in situations of injury is a bad way to go. I think with the second apron, with depth, and with the kind of to win 4 series, the different looks you need to face different teams is it means that situational guys have to be truly situational. There are games where Obi Toppin plays 5 minutes for Indiana. There's games he plays 30. There's games where Benedict Mathurin might not play because he has very obvious limitations. There's games like against the Knicks where they're switching and he's one of the few players who, for all his flaws, can punish a switch, get to the line. You play him more, right? And you have ways to cover for him in defense and all that. A coach who's willing to, one, go deeper into the bench, not as a rule, but when the situation dictates it, and have the guys ready. You might play 0 tonight. We might need you. And be willing to experiment and give yourself as many different looks as possible. Even with 7 guys, there are lots of different permutations, right? Of those 7 guys, and not being hung up to one. Because I think it made sense when Tibbs got here, because you're building a team identity. You're giving guys clear roles. These are vets. These are adaptable guys who played on multiple teams, who have seen the NBA, who understand how to adapt. And if they are struggling with a certain configuration, that's more reason to try it a little bit more, right? To get them that familiarity instead of just familiarity with one lineup or one or a few standard lineups they play in. So those would be the top two, and then I would agree on holding the vets accountable, for the reasons we already talked about. So
yeah, yeah, I think the offensive creativity and all that type of stuff is definitely high up there. And I didn't want to diminish it. I just think that getting the lineups, like we've talked about this before, lineups, like optimizing your rotation and lineups is 90% of getting the most out of your team. And I think part of that is experimentation with different looks throughout the course of a season. So when you go into the playoffs, like, oh, I'm down 10 with 2 minutes left. I need to what's my best offensive lineup, right? What's the lineup that gives me the best chance? What's my best lineup in terms of trying to force turnovers, press the ball, play full court, like all those type of things. If you don't try it during the regular season, you don't experiment in the regular season, you're not going to know. And you're kind of flying blind. And I do think that was an issue for Tibbs. And it's ironic, right? It's not ironic, but it's kind of funny in the sense of one of the knocks on him, right, consistently is didn't experiment with anything during the regular seasons. And that's not just a criticism of him this year. It's a criticism of him kind of throughout his career as a head coach, and certainly all 4 or 5 years in New York. But then he'd be willing to like try more stuff in the playoffs as he's like trying to search for answers to pivot and adjust. And I think that's kind of a weird thing that was true about him. But I don't want to belabor the coaching search thing anymore, just because I'm a little bit like ambivalent about it, in the sense of whoever they hire, like, it's hard for me to have strong thoughts about that person as far as like their ability to coach up the team, and like how are they like, what are they good at, what are their X's and O's and all that type of things, without seeing it. Like okay, doesn't like I could feel great about the guy they hire, and then maybe 15 games in, I'm like, this sucks, right? I mean, we just saw this with Milwaukee a couple years ago, where they hired AJ Griffin or whatever, or Adrian Griffin, sorry, I should say. Everybody loved that move at the time, and then within fucking 10, 15 games, you already were hearing people and seeing reports and stuff about how he was in over his head and he wasn't good, and Bucks fans weren't happy with him. So like, you could get a candidate that seems to check all the boxes. We see this all the time, right? Oh, this guy seems like really good. We did that with Fizdale. It was like, oh, Fizdale's great. He's, he worked his way up from the video room all the way to being Spo's top assistant or whatever. And this is a great hire. He has player development chops and all. And then we saw it in New York and we're like, this guy fucking sucks. He's terrible. I don't understand anything he's doing. So you don't know until you see it. And I think a lot of people that were skeptical of the Knicks hiring Tibbs initially, one, I think it's funny, a lot of those people who were skeptical about his hire are, let's just say some of them are people that are like, oh my God, how could they fire Thibodeau now? But forgetting media folks, but like even fans that were skeptical of the Thibodeau hire, if you gave them truth serum, even if they hate Tibbs, I think they would tell you like, yeah, he did a pretty good job. He did a pretty good job. So, you don't know until you see it. And that's kind of like why I'm not going to say I'm checked out on the coaching search, because that's not true, but I'm just a little bit more like, yeah, I don't know. We'll see what happens once they hire somebody, and I can have maybe more stronger opinions about it then. But even then, I think I'll be like, yeah, that's cool. Let's see what happens when they get together in, late September for training camp, and see what it looks like in preseason and the early part of the regular season before really having any strong feelings about it one way or the other.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked a lot about this coaching search. I think we've both said that, I'll add one other thing. I think for people with the Dolan conspiracy theories, it's a bit of a stretch for any person who isn't insane to force your executive who's gotten you so much success after your most successful season in 25 years to fire the coach and have that forced on them, right? Or to meddle in that way. Dolan is selling tickets. Dolan is seeing the Knicks talked about in a more positive light, again, than they have been for the last 25 years. So I want to throw that out there. But I do want to say, we've talked about, I think you and I have both acknowledged that the roster still isn't a fully baked product, and that there were very troublesome things that Tibbs did and did not do that indicate that even when that happens, he won't be able to maximize it in a league that's increasingly built on winning on margins versus just overall talent. Even look at the finals. Like, everyone says Oklahoma City is so much more talented than everyone else. And that's, by the way, with a lot of, they've stocked up draft picks. They've been patient. They've had, the Paul George trade turned into a trade for a superstar we didn't realize at the time, while also giving them all those picks. So that said, the talent gap doesn't, like, Indiana won game one. Indiana didn't fully lose the rope on the road in game two with Oklahoma City desperate. So the talent gaps are less, and we'll see what happens with Wemby. He doesn't seem like, I said this to someone and they pushed back and said, well, Jokic is that guy who's so much better than everyone else. It doesn't seem like there's a LeBron. It doesn't seem like there's a Michael Jordan. And even LeBron didn't dominate the league. He had 4 titles in 20 years. We'll see what happens next year. But the age of, Magic and Larry winning almost every year, Jordan winning every year, Celtics in the 60s, those seem to be, by design, going away. So the margins become much more important. Coaching is probably more important than it has been in the past. Having said all that, what are the roster changes you would make? I don't have to ask because I know the answer. I know you don't want to trade Cat for Kevin Durant. I think we've both said if you have the opportunity to get Giannis without trading Brunson, really, you do it. You go for it. Assuming they don't do those two things, I think, what do you think they're going to focus on in terms of personnel this offseason?
I couldn't tell you. I really couldn't tell you. Like, I think there's a lot of ways they can go. So much of this to me hinges on Cat. And I mean that in the sense of, what do they see his position as? Where do they see his position as full time? Or where do they expect him to play the majority of his minutes? I think it's interesting that the word we got is that analysts, people in the front office, whatever, were suggesting to Tibbs to start Mitch, with him. That was the adjustment they wanted to see. I think that might be informative. As to, hey, this is kind of the position we want to use him in. I think that has value for a few reasons. And I'll tell you those reasons right now. If you play Cat at the 4, that means you can slot Mikal and OG down at the 2 and the 3. It means you can move Josh Hart back to the bench. And that naturally kind of increases your perimeter and, in terms of guard and wing depth, because you're not playing small as much. You're not playing with 4 wings and a big as much. That's one thing I do like about that. The reason I like that is because I think it's really hard with the kind of TPMLE the Knicks might have, veteran minimums, and even their their options in terms of trades. I think it's really hard for them to get the caliber of wing that can really move the needle for them in terms of depth. I think it's a lot easier to find quality center depth, and I think it's possible that center depth already exists on the roster in the form of Ariel Hukporti. I would also say that at times last year, I felt we were undersized, and playing big obviously helps you with that. And I think getting physically stronger, I think getting bigger in general in with the roster is something that they need to look at. Um, in terms of the 4 minutes last year, it was mostly just OG Anunoby, right? I mean, it was mostly OG Anunoby, and then maybe Precious before Mitch got back, and then I mean, it was Josh Hart, right? It was just weird. Like they didn't really have a true four on the roster aside from OG, and even OG is not really a true four. So I would consider, like, I think getting a guy that can be a legit power forward to give you legit power, can play the four. That might be something that I'm pretty intrigued in. I know on Jeremy over at Knicks Film School, he talked about a guy like maybe Gershon Yabusele, as kind of a forward that they could maybe target. I think that's an interesting look. I think a guy like Jake LaRavia, who's more of a big wing type, but he can play at the four a bit. I think he's somebody to look at. I think in a weird way, a guy like Al Horford is an interesting player to look at. Not that you want him playing a bunch of four at his age, but who's the four and who's the five when he plays next to, if he plays next to Karl Anthony Towns? Who knows? I just think like that's something I'm pretty focused on, and I think if you commit to playing Karl more at the four, it might help you stretch your limited resources this offseason a bit further than if you're more committed to him playing predominantly at the five. Maybe if they think actually the best thing to do is to play Karl Anthony Towns at the five, then you just have to roll with that and move from there. But I have a little bit of a different viewpoint on that. That's just my thought. I think that between the last couple of years, we've seen Karl Anthony Towns with a guy like Rudy Gobert, a guy like Mitchell Robinson, obviously. Those lineups have tended to be really good and have kicked some ass. And I think hide some of his defensive limitations, give him, help mitigate that stuff. I think that's something to be cognizant of. That would be me. I also think they could definitely use another guy that can create off the bounce. And this is where it's tricky. I think the guy, I don't think it needs to be somebody who's like a full-time point guard or whatever, but I do think it's important that player needs to be able to play next to Jalen Brunson. Because part of the issue we had this year is that aside from Jalen Brunson, we didn't have anybody that could consistently get into the paint, create off the bounce, whatever. So I would, that's another, like a guy that can create off the bounce. Again, doesn't need to be the world's most dynamic playmaker, but just somebody that can do it and then play next to Brunson and allow him to play off ball at times more. That would be very useful. And I guess maybe the third thing that I would like to see them do is get somebody who can shoot threes at volume and specifically be able to hit from above the break. Those would be my kind of three things if you're trying to figure out what. So I guess maybe not. I answer the question in terms of like what I think the Knicks should do. What do I think they will do? I don't know. What I do think is good is that Stefan Bondi and Steve Popper of Newsday both reported that the Knicks' interest in Kevin Durant is not legitimate. I have never thought that it was actually legitimate, so that makes me happy. I think the Knicks are being used to help drive up his market, generate interest. So, yeah, I mean, to answer your question without really answering what you specifically asked me, that would be my answers.
Yeah, so I'm definitely into LaRavia. I think, on your point about another creator, I think that's kind of always been the thing, is that if there is a guy who can actually create offense on the bench and is enough of a defensively viable player to play next to Brunson and isn't a spacing issue, you're talking about Derek White. Those guys are pretty highly coveted. We saw this with the Knicks had a player like that. He was overqualified for that role because most guys who have those things would say, I want to run my own show. This is what happens when you run the show, right? That's what happened with Quickly, though, right? I don't think it was any bad blood, but there were teams willing to pay him like a starting point guard and not like a hybrid combo guard off the bench. It's tough to find those guys. This is always the pushback I've had on Colin Sexton. One, to your point, I don't know if he could play next to Brunson, but even if you had a coach who was willing to do that and he could figure out ways to make that viable, this is a guy who's he's capable of being a starting point guard and paid like it. That creates constraints. I do think that, and this goes back to coaching as well, we need to find out what we have in all of the guys we drafted last year. The Knicks do not have a draft pick this year in the first round. They have 50, but as well as they've drafted, it's tough to count on that. So they took 4 players. One, I agree with you. Hakordi already looks like at least a minimum viable rotation player.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's already shown me more than Jericho Sims did, and that's not a knock on Sims.
And he's like, I mean, we have to be fair. Like, Hakordi has some injury concerns himself, so that's obviously something to keep an eye on. But to the point you're making, like, I think what's really interesting with him is how athletic he looked. And we saw Mitch, obviously, he surprised us, kind of like, wow, okay, he can still move like really, really fucking well. And he still got quite a bit of bounce. Like, and watching him in those minutes with Cat, you could that was another frustration of this year, right? Where I'm like, God, why the fuck didn't we just play Hakordi with Cat a little bit more? Would have been nice to see that, just to kind of get a better idea of how Cat plays at the 4 next to another 5. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, I totally agree. It was another part of, we don't need to rehash that. But yeah, so you have one potential viable rotation piece. You have a guy who's gotten into games when there's been injuries and looked viable, maybe not playoff viable in Kolek, right? There are the defensive concerns. He doesn't really have gravity in the same way, but he's probably, I think it's not unfair to Brunson to say that Kolek is the best passer on the roster. Knows how to generate pace, control the game. So he looks like at least a true situational piece. But the wild card is Pacome Dadier. Now, you can say, there were the salary thoughts, that was beneficial to the Knicks. But this is a guy they took who has some potential. There are a lot of draft guys who think that maybe it's boom or bust. He looks physically ready. I think there's a lateral agility issue that maybe is tough to overcome, but he is pretty athletic and smart. He just needs those reps. I do think the next coach needs to lean into that, whether or not they get a wing, because if they get a wing who is valuable, but Dadier looks like he's ready to take that next step, now you get another trade chip. One of those guys becomes a trade chip at that point. On a team that is a bit limited in terms of those low salary but enticing guys. And so that would be the other thing. Well, I know you don't watch a G League or anything, right? I know you like Dadier from what you've seen. Obviously, there's a ways to go.
The only thing I watch is the NBA when it comes to basketball, correct?
You don't watch the WNBA?
I've tried to watch a little bit more this year, but I can't say I'm not like locked in on the WNBA now.
Yeah, it's Seattle. That's all we have. So I haven't been to a Storm game yet, but I've been following them a little bit more. But could those answers be on the roster, and how soon do you think we'd find out if they are? And we have 2 wings, by the way, who we drafted last year. Right? There's Dadier, who I think is a little bit more prototypical in terms of the skill set and size, but McCullough is more pro ready, right? So.
I mean, it's hard to know. It's hard to know because I don't think Dadier shot particularly well in the G League, but Prez has better insight on that stuff than I do. He's talked about how he changed his form and blah, blah, blah. We know Dadier was taken a bit as a project. We also know for sure that part of the appeal was his willingness to kind of slot his salary in a certain way that gave the Knicks more flexibility to operate under the second apron. That was part of it. I tend to think that they're likely to give him. I don't think the Knicks have ever operated in a way of like, they don't draft guys to just like immediately turn around and trade them. Obviously, I know that's a little bit ironic to say, considering, they've traded Obi Toppin, they've traded Emmanuel Quickley, they've traded Quentin Grimes, but like, those guys all got opportunities. They actually played for the Knicks for multiple seasons. Grimes was a starter. Emmanuel Quickley should have won 6th Man of the Year. Obi Toppin, he probably got the least rope of all of them, and I think that was more to do with Tibbs than it had to do with the organization. So So like they have given their young players opportunities and time, more importantly, time to develop, time to establish themselves. Deuce McBride wasn't even a part of the rotation 2.5 years in before they extended him, right? And then, obviously we know why that was the case, but whatever. I think that Dadier will get, my assumption is that, part of the reason that a guy like Thibodeau, maybe they had just soured on him organizationally, is that reluctance to give guys opportunities at times. And I think whoever they hire will be somebody that, I'm not saying they're going to hand these guys minutes, but at least will give them a legitimate shot. Because I think it's hard to say any of those rookies got a legitimate shot.
Yeah, you've talked about the random Tuesday night in Charlotte in February, right? Those are the opportunities, right?
Right. And also just like, we saw a little bit of Dadier earlier in the season, and I wasn't like, this guy's amazing, but I also wasn't like, I didn't think he was unplayable. We saw a little bit of Huck Porty, and I was like, I wish we saw a lot more of Huck Porty. Saw a little bit of Kolek early in the season, and I was kind of like, I thought it was weird that he just totally disappeared from the rotation. Not that he was like the greatest player ever, but I was just like, I actually think he's okay. Like he's playing okay.
Well, he brings a skill set that the roster lacks, right? Which is kind of that playmaker. If he was not a defensive liability, it actually is the perfect kind of skill set to play next to Brunson to allow him to focus more on scoring and ball movement and all that. So,
yeah. So I would assume these players will get chances. You draft a guy in the first round versus a guy that was taken with the 56th pick or whatever with McCullough. I'm assuming Dadier is going to he's going to be more of a priority. Quite honestly, if I'm the organization, I would there's something with Dadier. You see the build, you see the tools there. You kind of
we did say the same things about Kevin Knox. So,
I mean, Kevin, I feel a lot more confident about Pacome Dadier's defensive capabilities after like watching him for about 7 minutes than Kevin Knox. But it behooves you as a team to give this guy and give this kid a real chance. Now, maybe that doesn't need to mean that he's immediately handed minutes next season. In fact, I would say if he's not ready, or if you don't think he's good enough for it, then you shouldn't do that. But just give him. I think you got to give him time. I really think it's a mistake to just chuck him into a trade or something. And I'm not saying that they are going to do that. Just the record. I just think that they will. That they should be willing to, I guess, is maybe the way to put it. I do think Huck Porty is going to be in the rotation. I have a strong inclination to believe that Tyler Kolek will have a very good chance of being in the rotation. Those are the two guys I would look at and be like, they have a chance. I think with Dadier and McCullough, it's a little bit more up in the air. It wouldn't infuriate me if they sign another wing who potentially cuts into the opportunities that either of those guys have. But the good thing with wings is, what do we know about wings, right? Like you can kind of just play wings together, unless it's Josh Hart, Mikal Bridges, and OG Anunoby. No, but like wings are kind of interchangeable. So I don't think it's a problem if you bring in, let's say, Jake LaRavia or Gary Trent Jr. And okay, maybe that guy is going to be higher in the rotation than a player like Dadier. But if Dadier is showing you something in practice, in training camp, or whatever, and in the limited opportunities he gets, I think you can always still find ways to play those guys together. I don't view that as a problem, is probably the way I would look at it. So, what do I think they need, or what do I think those kids like? How will the Knicks approach it? I think the Knicks want them to get a chance. That's, we can talk about a lot of what Tom Thibodeau did or didn't do. But part of that conversation, which I don't think happens often enough, is how that may have not aligned with other people within the organization at times.
I think we've talked about, you've mentioned, right? It seems like there was an accumulation of issues, right? He didn't get fired because of Deuce McBride. He didn't get fired because of Pacome Dadier. But these are recurring patterns, right? And it does seem like even when he likes a guy and he does a good job developing, he doesn't bear the fruits of that, right? Emmanuel quickly didn't start at point guard until either the season was over or Brunson got hurt. Grimes was a guy that I think Tibbs liked a lot. He did not start until there were injuries, or it wasn't injuries. I think it was like the COVID, just everyone got COVID. So he started Deuce and Grimes. He didn't start Deuce McBride until Quickly was complete, or he didn't play him significant minutes really until Quickly was out. So I think you want a coach that, and that's why the whole rigid, these are the guys who play, and these are the guys who are situational only if those guys aren't available, breaks down. Because to the point you made earlier, you don't know who's going to surprise you. As much as practice is helpful, it's not a game. It's not a game that we go out there and kill ourselves for. We're talking about practice. It's not a game. It's I do think that'll be a priority. I mean, I think you said you want big depth. You have a 40. You want a guy who can maybe play the 4. According to Prez, Dadier has defined well enough. He's 6'9" with a 6'11" wingspan. Probably can handle the 4. That might be his best position if lateral quickness is the issue, rather than having to guard Jason Tatum or whatever. And you talk about a secondary ball handler who could maybe even move Brunson off ball at times. It's Kolek, right? So we have potentially on some of the roster. With the TPMLE, I do want to ask this. Prez thinks you don't even have to use the whole thing to get to LaRavia. It would seem to me that Gary Trent Jr. I think is coming off a season where he shot 43% from 3 on like 11 threes per 100. So he is a sniper. I doubt he would be available for that. I think a guy like Beasley or even Tim Hardaway Jr. is probably out of that range as well. It seems to me, right, like get a guy like LaRavia. If Steven Adams wants to chase a ring for more than so Steven Adams is he's older in his career, injury prone, right? But if you can get him ideally for a vet min or maybe use part of the TPMLA to sign him and LaRavia, what you get, I think, with Adams is when we have proof of concept of an elite offensive rebounder, which he still is. He's up there with Mitchell Robinson when he plays. You got to prove. We've seen what that looks like next to Cat. They maul the glass. Adams is a still pretty viable rim protector, and he gives you a little bit of a different look on offense, where he has that little floater. He can dribble with the ball. I don't think he's quite Hartenstein, but it gives you like a facsimile of that skill set. I think you get LaRavia, you get Adams, make 40 work for it. Create some competition and some upside. I think LaRavia is still only 23. He gives you a little bit more of that connective passing while being able to shoot. He's not a stalwart defender, but he has size and he's viable and smart. And then you have the competition. You see where it goes. I wouldn't mind bringing Landry Shamet and DeLon Wright back either. I think they proved that maybe they're a little underutilized. And for Shamet, he's coming back from the surgery. Wright, obviously traded for mid-season, takes time to get familiar with the players and all that. They have options without breaking the bank or having to make big moves to fix those depth things. And then you might find, I think, I don't think any of us who are more bullish on this roster than others who say Tibbs is given a raw deal. I don't think any of us is saying that maybe it's true Brunson and Cat cannot play together as the main stars and win you a title, especially when you're spending about $100 million on them annually. But then we'll find out, right? Because then depth will no longer be an excuse. The newness will no longer be an excuse. The rotations will be less of an excuse. If you're not playing an effective lineup so many minutes, if you have more diversity, if you're tapping into the different combinations as much as you can. And that gives you very important data that I don't think the Knicks are sold that they have yet, even though I think a lot of commentators are sold that this roster is just not going to work.
Yeah. The Adams thing is weird. I mean, I don't think the Knicks will be able to get him. I think Houston wants to keep him. They have every advantage in doing so. So my assumption would be he stays there. But yeah, I mean, again, I hate to go back to it, but it's just this is why it's so frustrating that like nothing was attempted this year, because it makes what do we truly need? What needs to be added? I mean, we have ideas. We have some things we can talk about and things that we generally believe to be true, but like, how would we feel about, do we need another wing? Do we need another guard if we had used our depth better or in different ways last season? How would we feel about going into the season with Huck Porty as like the kind of for sure backup or third center, however you want to put it, if we had played him more? We don't have the answers to these questions. So you're operating a little bit, I don't want to say blind, but you're operating a bit in the dark there. Yeah, I just it's not going to be easy, and some of that has to do with none of this, lack of information, or some of it is just the nature of how much they're constrained, and we'll see what they do. I kind of wonder a little bit about, what will they do? Can they do something in trade? I'm not entirely certain that just because they fired Tibbs, all these guys are coming back, like their main core 7 guys. Specifically, I think Josh Hart is a player that, not saying they're going to be shopping him, but I don't think they would be against moving him in the right scenarios. I think Mikal Bridges is a guy to keep an eye on in terms of in the right scenario, they'd move him. Deuce McBride, I mean, he makes such a little money. I don't know that it even makes sense to trade him.
He'd have to be a sweetener, right?
Right, and I just don't know how much can you really consolidate, given your lack of depth or proven depth, I should say, at this moment.
Well, I mean, it's like if you do Cat for Giannis, right?
Yeah,
it's probably going to be like, just fucking give us Deuce, dude. And you really can't say no, right? It's like, we're trading the better player. You better give us everything you have. That's enticing, and Deuce is enticing on that contract.
And I would so the Mitchell Robinson, right? Okay, you can trade him. He was really fucking good though last year, and again, I think if you trade him, you almost have to make sure you're getting a big man either in free agency or back in a trade or whatever, maybe in the draft. I don't know, because I would not feel great about going into the season with just Cat and Huck Porty as my bigs. I think you're really thin. But Mitch Robinson only makes $12.9 million. How many guys? And then like we talked about, if you're doing consolidation, we're going to trade Mikal and Mitch for somebody? Who's that player? I don't know. Mikal or Josh Hart and Mitch for somebody? Who's that player? Like
it's all great to me.
Yeah, it's not going to be an easy offseason for them in the sense of, again, you don't have probably all the information you'd love to have with how all these pieces fit together, what lineups work the best, blah, 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 like the sample sizes and everything. You don't have that information because it wasn't attempted last year. We have theory, we have ideas, we have
theory only get you so far.
Yeah. Well, yeah. We have glimpses into like what could potentially work. We don't have enough of a sample size to know for sure that those things work. So that's really difficult for them to navigate. And then on top of it, you have all the cap constraints, like I just mentioned, and you're kind of, how willing are you to consolidate pieces? How much does that even make sense? Which is another reason why the KD thing doesn't make any sense to me. It's like, okay, well, if they don't want Cat, now we have to consolidate 2 or 3 guys minimum. How does that mean? Is that really what you want to do? So So, I would, to me, the best version of this offseason is probably you obviously nail the head coach hire, whoever it is, hopefully. But in terms of just the roster, I think it's just hey, can you get a guy, really just get me another guy who can play the 4, really? I think that's kind of key. And then getting another guy who can handle the ball and play next to Jalen Brunson. If there's a way that you can get that done between the TPMLE, the taxpayer exception, the level exception, and vet mins and moving kind of marginal pieces around at the back end of the roster or whatever, that would be a great offseason. They have the 50th pick. Maybe you can do something there. I have no clue.
You haven't read all of Prez's breakdowns on the draft season channel in Discord? You don't watch the clips he sends you?
He stopped sending me clips. It's great. I think he knows I don't care about the draft. Maybe if they trade up, I'll get interested. But yeah, I mean, those are things to consider. And
I think if you look at the guys they've picked, they picked Jericho Sims and Ariel Hukporti. Both were Hukporti didn't play in the playoffs. Sims played in the playoffs, right? And if nothing else, Sims is a guy who has lasted in the league, and there's proof from another team. They've done a good job of drafting in the second round. Speaking of, there was a recent report. Rokos Jokubaitis says, "I'm not playing summer league this year. They want me. With the Kolek pick, it doesn't seem like there would be an opportunity that would be enticing enough for him to come here and compete for." Do you think this is the summer where maybe they see what they dangle his contract to a place that maybe can use him? They also tend to do right by players. So if he is I want to play in the NBA, I don't want to play in a place where there's no security about a rotation spot, send me somewhere where that is an avenue, maybe Charlotte or Sacramento or something. I'm just throwing names out there. Do you think this is the summer where maybe that gets resolved?
Can you kind of just clear that up again? I'm sorry.
Yeah. So Jokubaitis, there was a video interview.
He's not coming over, man. Who cares?
No, I'm saying, do you think this is the season they move him? Right? Because what we saw with Obi is they got not a good return, but because of Rose's relationship, because it seems like they prioritize doing right by players. Right? They traded Grimes to a place where he had opportunity. They traded quickly to a place where they got good opportunity. Obviously, in those two cases, there were guys they wanted on that team. But with Obi, it was less just about getting the maximum return. And clearly, there was an idea that let's send him to a place where he fits, even if it turns out to bite us a little bit. Rokubaitis, or Jokubaitis. Do you think this is the summer they move him? Right, not just because he's not coming to summer league. His agent might be telling them, look, if you're not going to play this guy or give him an opportunity that's enticing, trade him somewhere where he'll have that.
Maybe, I could see it. If he wants to come over, sure. I just don't know what his market is. I know he has pretty decent numbers. Is it really value? I don't know. If he does, that's great. The Knicks should do it because I don't think there's any place for him. I mean, the other determinant. I mean, look, if you're to the point you're making, he's what, 6'4", something, 6'5". Jokubaitis, he's a pretty big guard, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Maybe you bring him over. You need to fill out your bench. You need to have controllable contracts, cheap contracts, whatever. I know he had a good year wherever he played. Where did he play? Maccabi Tel Aviv or something. Maybe they liked what they saw and maybe they'll bring him over. I don't know. But if they're not going to bring him over, yeah, why not? Go for it. Trade him. Because this feels like if it's not going to happen now, when is it going to happen? So yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, definitely an interesting offseason ahead, even as the coaching situation drags on. It does seem to me like Mike Brown and Johnnie Bryant. That's, I think, my gut feeling right now. Like, those are the guys. And they're doing their due diligence. I think they'll talk to other assistants. I think they'll talk to a guy like Nori. I think they'll talk to Pablo. If for nothing else, I think that there seems to be a priority to do right by their past players. Right, we saw them bring all the vets back to the Garden. If there is an up-and-coming coach, you'd want to have a good relationship with him, and it helps him if he's being mentioned now as a candidate. It gets his name out there. So I think they'll talk to assistants. I just have a feeling it's Bryant or Brown that's going to be the choice.
Yeah, I'm just hesitant to I don't know. I'm a little unsure of what they're doing. I have my conspiracy theory about Johnnie Bryant. There's been reporting from Chris Persianen of Clutch Points and Knicks Film School that they will, look at college coaches as well. No names have been named, I don't believe yet, so we'll see. It seems like they've either talked to or will talk to Mike Brown. We don't know. The idea of Johnnie Bryant and Mike Brown to me is very good. I think that could be a really nice kind of 1-2 punch on the bench. The other good thing I think with a guy like Johnnie Bryant is we know he has player development chops. I know it sounds stupid to care about that when the Knicks are, they were a 51-win team that was 2 wins away from going to their first finals in 26 years. With their cap situation and with how the current CBA is, player development is pretty important. So that would be nice. I think Mike Brown is a pretty astute basketball mind, whatever your misgivings are about him as a head coach, or I don't, I'm not saying you have misgivings, talking more to the audience. Yeah, I like Mike Brown. I would have supported hiring him. I would have been fine hiring him back in 2020. I don't really think that what happened in Sacramento is his fault. That roster, he got them to achieve kind of what, I don't know, the best you could really hope for them to achieve. I didn't think that issues with that team had much to do with him. I know that they struggled with this season when he was there, and then they took off, use that term very relatively speaking, once Doug Christie took over. But if you kind of look at their underlying metrics, he was getting pretty unlucky to start this season. And I think they were always going to improve over the course of 82 games. So, yeah, I mean, I'm cool with Mike Brown. I'm cool with that. It's not, and I mean, to be clear, none of these names are like guys that I'm like, as soon as Tibbs was fired, this is a guy that I was like, he's my number one choice. I mean, Johnnie Bryant kind of was, just because I think there's a value to the guys. The guy was here. The Knicks know him. He knows the Knicks, obviously, their hierarchy, the ownership, the players, a lot of the players in the locker room. Like, we already had that pre-existing comfort. So that was kind of my choice from the beginning. The fact that he probably would be cheaper than other coaches, I think, is interesting, because it might give you more headroom to spend on filling out the assistant coaching staff. So I think that's something to consider as well. So yeah, I mean, Johnnie Bryant, Mike Brown, I'm cool with. There could be other names that come up that I'd be cool with. I think Frank Vogel is somebody that is kind of like an interesting person to look at. I thought he got a somewhat of a raw deal in LA. So that's somebody to consider. Trying to think of other names that have been listed so far. Taylor Jenkins is somebody who's been mentioned. I'd be lying to you if I told you I had any strong thoughts about Taylor Jenkins. I'd never watched Memphis nearly enough to have strong feelings about him. And I think in some ways he was a bit undermined this season.
Do you think Taylor was fired too swiftly?
Dude, oh my God. So Yeah, I don't know. I'm just ready for kind of whoever it is to be a um different voice, operate differently than Tibbs, and just kind of evaluate the team in a new light. Because probably one of the frustrating things that happened over the course of the season is because Tibbs he's so rigid in the sense of like we know we after 5 years with the guy, you kind of know exactly what he's going to do, exactly what he's not going to do, and it makes the roster changes like that's the only thing you can talk about because there's nothing new to talk about from a tactical perspective, really. We know how they're going to operate. So that was frustrating. And yeah, I would be, we'll see. Again, Johnnie Bryant, Mike Brown, cool with that, but I'm not really pushing for any particular outcome here. I I still have trust in the front office to kind of land the plane, I guess, and select somebody who is good. Um, it gives me more confidence that the reporting that they were not actively in on KD. Good job, front office, not following for that Fugazi, and yeah, we'll see. I don't know. I guess the last thing I want to talk about, if you have time before we get out of here, what have you thought about the Karl Anthony Towns discussion that keeps popping up on Knicks Twitter, where it's like there are people that are desperate to get rid of him. There are people that are like, no, he was awesome this year. I don't know. I find him like getting the criticism he has a little bit much. Not because he's perfect. He definitely isn't. There's God knows that you've had meltdowns in our Discord about Karl Anthony Towns' defense many times. But like, I don't know. I largely am okay with Cat, and I mean, yeah, there are scenarios where I trade him. I just think the scenarios where we trade him and get better are not as abundant as some of the conversation around him seems to make it out to be.
Well, let's address one thing. Criticism on the court is fair. The conversation has taken a pretty dark tone in many places. John, I can't pronounce. Is it Krasinski from the Timberwolves beat? I believe he's the athletic writer for Minnesota. He got tired of this and he published or he shared an article he wrote about how much Cat meant to the community in Minnesota. Right, he's from New York. We lost the lottery that year, and he embraced Minnesota, a small market, when he was constantly in trade rumors. I think everyone gets frustrated, but there's a reason they were sad to see him go. And kind of the coded language around his mannerisms. Maybe he's corny, right? But you had Gilbert Arenas just with a bizarre monologue about Cat's body. That is where I think it's really crossing a line. I think the question is that's still being determined. Can you win with? I think can you win with defensive liabilities? Can you win a championship with that, where they're getting heavy minutes? Can you win with a center? I think it's always been a question. Can you win with a center who's a negative defender? Minnesota answered that by making a big trade for a 3-time defensive player of the year when Cat was still there. Can you afford to pay that kind of player $60 million? And is that worthwhile if you're pairing him with another player who's playing heavy minutes next to him, who's your other star, who's also a defensive liability at the point of attack? So your weakness is the point of attack and center. I think that's a very real conversation to have, where people lose kind of the plot and becomes emotional, whatever. I think you can win with Cat. I think he needs to play. What is useful about him is he can play both the 4 and the 5. If you have a guy that can hold up defensively at one of those positions and supercharge your offense to the extent that the defense doesn't matter, it can work. We've seen a team win with a defensive liability at the point guard position and the center position. For all the arguments that Cat is not in Jokic's stratosphere as a playmaker, well, I don't think Murray at this point is in the same stratosphere as Brunson. So we have some proof of concept. It can work. He makes a huge. If he was making Randall's money, I don't think this would be as much of a discussion. Combine that with the Bridges trade, combine that with the lack of flexibility and the fact that when you talk about salary, he might be, and just value, he might be your best opportunity to trade for another star. I get why the conversations happen, but I also don't think he was optimized. I think another data point we want to know, right, is how much of that was the roster and how much was him. The beginning of the season, teams played them defensively like a 5-out team, which means centers were on Cat. From there, we saw that he could not only drive on centers, but he's able to operate from the high post and pull the rim protector out, which meant you had guys diving into the paint and cutting. You're running off ball actions, and he's very adept at passing from that situation. He's also very adept at passing from the post. But when teams adapted, he was still getting his numbers, but the ability to impact and elevate his teammates, that's something we didn't even see that much of in the playoffs. He was generating a lot of offense, but it was straight line drives and it was 3-pointers, right? I think he averaged 1 assist to 2 turnovers in the playoffs. He's capable of more than that. And what's frustrating, not to beat a dead horse, but yes, we didn't see them try to optimize or use him in that role to create for others. So if you look at Cat as a non-creator, if he's just a play finisher, that's tough at $60 million a year when he's also not giving you defense. I think that I will say this. I've complained about Cat's defense. There were a couple games. There was game 1 against Indiana where I think he just went off script. That's something DJ's brought up. That's something that was noted in the article that was released right after the Knicks lost. I do think he goes off script and doesn't execute at times. But when he actually just switches, I'm kind of fine with it. He's going to get beat, whatever. If you use him creatively on defense, I think you can get to surviving his minutes when he's at the 5 on defense. And that might be all you need to do, because if you really maximize that offense, you get a lot out of you. You're probably going to still win those minutes. But you also want to be able to use him situationally at the 4. I think it's like, is he a 4? Is he a 5? What's his best position? It depends. And, if you put him next to Brunson and 3 elite defensive wings who can shoot, he's fine as a 5, I think. I think that lineup wins. You put him next to an elite offensive rebounder who can protect the rim, and the other guys are all shooters. We've seen that work. But it doesn't work every time. It worked against Boston, not as well against Indiana. Going with McBride or a shooter, let's imagine Gary Trent Jr. in that role with that lineup. That I think would have worked well against Indiana. I don't think it would have worked well against Boston, or not as well, if you had Deuce there, because size limitations and all that. So what he gives you is versatility and the ability to supercharge offense while giving you a baseline of defense. That does have value. Is it worth $60 million? Can it work with Brunson? We just don't know yet. But I haven't given up. So it was a frustrating playoffs. It was frustrating to watch the Knicks get Aaron Nesmith or whatever. But I don't think, I think this is the whole theme. Cat is central to that. Bridges, I think, is a little bit more concerning because he proved that he could be an efficient scorer without really amplifying anyone else. And that is a concern to me because they need him to be a secondary ball handler in their current construct. But with Cat, I think he is the player that most could potentially benefit from a coaching change. There wasn't really, I'm not even talking about getting him more touches. I'm saying putting him in a position where you have to worry about multiple things. And he's causing real problems for the defense. He was the player, I think, relative to the ability to do that, just wasn't put in those positions. That gap was the biggest with him. So it's another point where we need more data, and it's frustrating that we didn't get it.
Yeah, for sure. I don't have much more to add to that. I think I get it. The playoffs were very frustrating despite getting the Eastern Conference Finals. It almost felt like, whether people understand it or not, but I think, when we'd harp on like, I can't believe this thing that Tibbs is doing is stupid, and that thing is stupid. And it's like, yeah, but we're winning. And it's like, yeah, but are you really happy? Are you like watching this and you're super satisfied with all of it? I think that was there underlying that underlying current was felt throughout the fan base throughout, and it was, the way they lost Indiana, I think, kind of really drove it home. So we'll see.
It's also on that
I don't expect
note.
Cat to.
Sorry,
Yep.
I'll let you finish. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
On that note with Tibbs, I think there's a lot of people who are like, well, are any of the guys out there a better coach than Tibbs? It keeps getting to this linear view of coaching acumen that I think is what we have questioned. When you are coming off embarrassing 20 seasons, right? Whatever they won that year, was it 21 games they won in the COVID-shortened season? Only 4 with Tisdale. When you are coming off that, when your roster is basically a blank slate with no identity, and you want to establish competence and develop young players and create a culture, he's up there with anybody. They might hire a coach who in that situation is worse than him. I don't think that applies to Mike Brown. He's pretty good at that. That might be the case with Johnnie Bryant. It could also be the case that person is better for this roster. But I think people are looking at it too linearly as like they have to get a better coach than Tibbs now. And that's judged purely by previous accomplishment. Is Kidd really better than Tibbs? Are these guys actually better than Tibbs? That's painting with too broad a brush. Better in what situation? Better, with what kind of roster? So I think that's something for people to keep in mind. Whoever they hire and
better how?
Like they're a clown. They're meant to amuse the Knicks. I think he'd be a good coach, Joe Pesci.
You think he can command the locker room?
The two Utes are going to run a pick and roll. Two what, coach? That's your mascot. Oh, I thought you meant kids.
I think, I think it'll be interesting. Whoever they hire, I think it'll be somewhat of a breath of fresh air. Obviously, sometimes you get a whiff of something good. Sometimes you get a whiff of fucking ass. So hopefully it's the former for the Knicks.
I think Buddha said that first.
I think that's a good place. And this Prez. Stacy, anything that you'd like to plug before we get out of here?
Nothing to plug. You can follow me at StacyPatton89 on Twitter. I'm sure we'll have lots of content out once the coaching search is done. Keep an eye out for that. I'll plug that we just recently added YC to the Strickland podcast with Shwin. I know they just dropped their debut pod together. Shwin, you can talk more about that. But I actually really liked it, and looking forward to more of those going forward.
I have nothing to plug personally. Yep, YC is my new host, or my new co-host, I should say, on Strickland. So be on the lookout for that. We're going to try to make it more of a non-Knicks and broader NBA discussion podcast. It's a little bit hard during the finals, especially when nobody actually gives a shit about the finals and only cares about the Knicks coaching search. So that makes it hard. But hey, small markets, they're doing great work. Everybody loves watching the small markets, even though they've had 2 of the lowest rated games in recent finals history. I can't wait to hear more from Hardwood Paroxysm, Matt Moore. The genius that he is. Just definitely look at his gambling track record if you want to see how smart he is.
There's a tennis match that happened a whole ocean away that I think more people talked about than the finals so far. It was maybe one of the best matches ever, but fucking also Max or TNT getting they lose the NBA the first year they get the French Open. That happens. That was pretty interesting to see.
It was, and also to your point, no American in the final, and it was still, it was fucking. I've never seen a tennis match kind of like get the kind of coverage that was getting. So that was pretty cool to see. All right. Thank you again for listening. Hope everybody has a great week. Me and Prez will be recording tomorrow. So that'll be out for you on Friday. Peace.